Welcome back. Find a comfortable position and let the day begin to fall away. Softly we'll drift through a time when the Sahara lay green and still. If nights like this help, subscribe. There's a fresh one every evening. The steel tube came apart in two hands, slowly, the way a careful thing is always opened. Inside, packed tight and cold against the metal walls, was the core, a column of compressed sediment drawn from the floor of a basin in the central Sahara, a place where no lake has existed for thousands of years, and where the air in summer reaches temperatures that make the ground itself seem to radiate outward like a slow exhalation. The smell arrived before anything else could be properly examined. It was the smell of wet clay and something organic beneath that, something faintly vegetable and old, rising out of a core that had been sealed from the atmosphere since it was extracted from beneath the sand. The researchers working at the folding table noted it in the way field scientists note things that are not quite classifiable. A brief mention in the margin of a notebook, the kind of detail that accumulates without conclusion until enough of them together begin to mean something. The column itself was striped. That was the first and most important thing about it. Running lengthwise down the cylinder of compressed material were bands of dark and pale sediment, alternating with a regularity that looked, in the low morning light of the field tent, almost deliberate, as though someone had painted them there, as though the stripes were the result of intention rather than the patient arithmetic of deposition. The dark layers were rich in organic material, microscopic fragments of plant tissue, the preserved husks of pollen grains, too small to see without a lens, the decomposed remains of algae that had once floated in open water above this very spot. The pale layers between them were mineral, silty, finer grained, the kind of material that settles out of still water in dry seasons or accumulates as wind-blown dust when the water is gone entirely. Together, these bands formed a record. Each centimeter of that column represented, depending on the local sedimentation rate, somewhere between decades and centuries of accumulated time. The whole core was, in that sense, a kind of archive, dense, compressed, and entirely unaware of itself as such, holding a history of rain and drought and rain again in a sequence that no written record had ever approached in length. This is where the story of the Green Sahara lives most plainly, not in a museum case, not in a photograph, but in these layered columns of lake floor sediment drawn from basins that have been dry since before any civilization on Earth had learned to write. The evidence they contain is not dramatic. It requires a laboratory and a trained eye and considerable patience before it yields anything that could be called a finding. But what it tells once the pollen has been counted and the isotopes measured and the organic carbon dated is a story of such scale and such strangeness that the modern Sahara, the largest hot desert on Earth, 3,000 miles of rock and sand, and near absolute aridity, must be understood as only the most recent chapter in a much longer history, a history in which the desert was not always there. Earth's axis tilts. This is not a metaphor, and it is not a catastrophe. It is simply a feature of the planet's geometry, as unremarkable as the shape of its orbit, and yet it is responsible, over timescales of tens of thousands of years, for changes in climate so profound that entire continental ecosystems have risen and fallen in their wake. The tilt itself varies between roughly 22 and 24, 5 degrees over a cycle of approximately 41,000 years. But a separate and related motion compounds this. The slow wobble of the axis itself around a cone-shaped path, completing one full cycle approximately every 23,000 years. And This wobble is called axial precession, and its consequences for the distribution of solar energy across the planet's surface are not subtle. As the axis precesses, the timing of Earth's closest approach to the Sun shifts relative to the seasons of the northern hemisphere, altering how much solar radiation arrives at high latitudes during summer and winter. The word for this, in the technical literature, is insolation, the amount of solar energy incident on a given surface area. And approximately 11,000 years ago, the precession cycle reached a configuration that delivered significantly more insolation to northern hemisphere summers than the current orbital arrangement provides. The difference was not enormous. In absolute terms, the Sun was not dramatically closer, the planet was not fundamentally changed. But the climate system is not a linear machine, and small shifts in energy input at the right point in a web of interconnected atmospheric and oceanic feedbacks can produce changes that are much larger than the original forcing would suggest. What the increased northern hemisphere summer insolation of 11,000 years ago did, in practical terms, was intensify the thermal gradient between the heated African continent and the cooler North Atlantic Ocean lying to its west. A hot continent draws air inward and upward. A cooler ocean supplies moist air at lower altitudes. The monsoon, the great seasonal circulation of moisture-laden air from ocean to land that today brings rain to a belt of West Africa lying between roughly 15 and 18 degrees north latitude, shifted, it moved northward. The atmospheric machinery of the tropics reorganized itself around a new thermal architecture, and the rain followed. The records showing this are not theoretical, they are physical, extractable, measurable. They exist in the dark layers of sediment cores from lake basins across the Sahara, or in the preserved chemistry of ancient soils, in the pollen of grasses and trees that grew where nothing now grows, in the shells of freshwater snails recovered from deposits hundreds of meters above any modern water source. The period that these records collectively define runs from approximately 11,000 years ago to somewhere between 5,000 and 4,000 years ago, depending on region and on the particular proxy being examined. Researchers call it the African Humid Period. It is sometimes also called the Green Sahara. Both names are accurate. Both are, in a sense, understatements. At the peak of this humid interval, the period running from roughly 9,000 to 6,000 years ago, the Saharan regions that today receive fewer than 5 millimeters of annual rainfall were receiving enough moisture to support lakes, rivers, and continuous vegetation across millions of square kilometers. 5 millimeters of rain per year is the threshold below which almost nothing biological can establish itself with any consistency. It is the kind of aridity where the ground is bare rock or bare sand, and where the occasional rainfall event, happening perhaps once every few years, produces a brief flush of annual plants that complete their entire life cycle in a matter of weeks before the moisture is gone and the ground returns to its usual condition of absolute dryness. That is the Sahara today, over much of its interior. During the African Humid Period, those same regions were receiving enough rain to sustain permanent bodies of standing water, to maintain the growth of grasses and shrubs and trees, and to support populations of large mammals that require substantial quantities of water every day to survive. The contrast is not one of degree, it is one of kind. The West African monsoon's northward migration during this period was not a small adjustment. The modern northern limit of reliable seasonal rainfall sits at roughly 15 to 18 degrees north latitude, a line that, on a map, runs approximately through the Sahel, the dry transitional zone between the Saharan Desert and the Sudanian savanna to the south. During the African Humid Period, the rainfall extended beyond 23 degrees north latitude and possibly farther, deep into what is now the central and northern Sahara. 23 degrees north is the latitude of the Tropic of Cancer, a line that today cuts through some of the most forbidding desert terrain on Earth, through the Erg of Mauritania and the Algerian Tanais Rift and the Egyptian Western Desert. The rain that reached this latitude during the humid period was not merely occasional or marginal. The sediment records confirm it was sustained enough across growing seasons to support the northward expansion of savanna vegetation, the filling of lake basins, and the flowing of rivers through valley systems that are now buried under sand. The oceanic contribution to all of this is not secondary. The North Atlantic Ocean was warmer during the early to middle Holocene, the geological epoch that began at the end of the last ice age and within which the present day falls, than it is today. The reasons for this are themselves rooted in the orbital configuration. Greater summer insolation warmed the ocean surface, reducing the sea ice that had persisted at high latitudes during the glacial period, altering the pattern of currents and the distribution of thermal energy across the basin. A warmer North Atlantic evaporates more readily. More evaporation means more water vapor available to the air masses that move inland across West Africa during the monsoon season, which means more moisture delivered to the continental interior when those air masses rise and cool and release their load. Some researchers have argued that without this oceanic amplification, without the additional moisture supply provided by a warmer Atlantic, the orbital forcing of the monsoon alone would not have been sufficient to push the rainfall as far north as the sediment records indicate it reached. The ocean and the atmosphere were not separate drivers, they were coupled components of a single system, each reinforcing the other's behavior. There is a sediment core kept in a cold storage facility at a research institution in Europe, drawn from the floor of the North Atlantic, far from the African coast, from a depth of more than 2 kilometers below the sea surface. The core is unremarkable to look at, a cylinder of pale gray and beige sediment, slightly compressed, labeled at one end with a site code, and a depth range printed in a narrow academic typeface. The data extracted from it, however, are a sequence of oxygen isotope measurements taken from the shells of microscopic organisms, foraminifera, that lived at the ocean's surface thousands of years ago and sank to the seafloor when they died, becoming incorporated into the sediment record one generation at a time. The ratio of oxygen isotopes in those shells reflects the temperature of the water in which the organisms lived. Running down a column of numbers on a printed data sheet, each value separated from the next by a fixed depth interval corresponding to a fixed period of time, the record shows the North Atlantic warming gradually after the end of the last ice age, reaching its peak in the early to middle Holocene, and then cooling gradually toward the present. That cooling is not dramatic on the scale of the numbers. It is a few tenths of a degree, measured in isotope ratios, recorded in the chemistry of shells, smaller than a grain of sand, but it corresponds in time and in magnitude to the weakening of the monsoon and the drying of the Sahara. The ocean kept its record while the land kept its own, and the two records read together tell the same story. The timing of that drying, the end of the African Humid Period, is itself a subject of ongoing scientific discussion, and the discussion is worth settling into for a moment, because it reveals something important about how climate systems behave. A simple orbital forcing would produce a simple response. As the precession cycle carried the northern hemisphere summer insolation back down toward its modern levels, the monsoon would have retreated southward at a steady, gradual pace, and the Sahara would have dried slowly and uniformly across its extent, but the sediment and pollen records do not show this. Some sites show a gradual, multi-millennium decline in humidity, a slow retreat of the vegetation, the lakes shrinking progressively over thousands of years, the pollen assemblages shifting from savanna grasses toward desert species in incremental steps. Other sites show something much more abrupt, a transition from humid to arid conditions, accomplished not over millennia, but over centuries or even decades, a rapid drying that appears in the stratigraphic record as a sharp boundary rather than a gradual gradient. This asymmetry between sites that dried slowly and sites that dried abruptly is what researchers mean when they speak of nonlinear threshold behavior in the climate system. The phrase refers to a system that does not always respond proportionally to its inputs, a system that can absorb a gradually changing forcing for a long time, maintaining a relatively stable state, and then suddenly reorganize into a new configuration when some internal threshold is crossed. A lake that has been maintained by a monsoon, slowly weakening over centuries, will at some point begin to lose water faster through evaporation than it receives through rainfall and inflow. Once that happens, the lake shrinks. A smaller lake exposes more dry ground at its margins. Dry ground reflects sunlight differently than wet ground or water surface, and that difference in reflectivity, called albedo, feeds back into the local atmosphere, reducing the likelihood of rainfall over the newly desiccated area. Less rainfall means more drying. More drying means more change in reflectivity. The system accelerates its own transition. What began as a slow, externally driven change becomes, at a certain point, a self-reinforcing collapse, and the stratigraphic record of such a site shows not a gradual drying, but an abrupt one, a line in the sediment, a boundary where the dark organic layers simply stop and are replaced with very little transition by pale mineral silt or wind-blown sand. The Earth, across this period, was not behaving catastrophically. Nothing about the orbital precession cycle or the slow cooling of the North Atlantic is catastrophic. These are the ordinary, patient operations of a planetary system that has been cycling through comparable configurations many times before, across hundreds of millions of years. The wobble of the axis, the variation of the orbit, the slow drift of oceanic temperatures, these are not events in the human sense. They are motions. They are the turning of a mechanism so large that no individual component within it experiences the turning directly. The Saharan landscape during the humid period did not know it was going to dry. The lakes did not anticipate the sand. The grasses that grew where only rock now exists had no information about the orbital configuration that was making their existence possible. They simply grew in the conditions that existed, and when the conditions changed, they retreated southward into refugia, into isolated pockets of moisture where geography or local hydrology maintained something of the old conditions, even as the surrounding terrain reverted to desert. There is a diagram published in a paleoclimatology paper, reproduced in a textbook, now familiar to anyone who has studied the Holocene climate record, that plots the tilt of Earth's axis against time, running from 25,000 years before the present to the present day. The curve is smooth and simple. It rises to its maximum somewhere around 11,000 years before the present, where the line peaks and holds briefly before beginning its long descent. The descent is as smooth as the rise. There is no sudden drop, no discontinuity, nothing in the shape of the curve that would suggest urgency or alarm. It is simply an arc, the kind of arc that a pendulum traces, or the path of a stone thrown in a long and patient parabola. The x-axis is measured in thousands of years. Each tick mark represents a span of time longer than the entire recorded history of human civilization. The curve rises and falls across that span with the same untroubled geometry as a hill seen from a great distance. What that smooth curve produced at the scale of the Saharan landscape was anything but smooth. The transition from the green world to the desert world was, in places, sudden enough to be catastrophic for the specific biological communities that had established themselves in the most marginal parts of the humid zone. But the mechanism itself, the orbital precession, the oceanic feedback, the northward and southward migration of the monsoon, was not catastrophic. It was simply the way the planetary system operates, and it had done so before, and it would do so again. The Green Sahara was not a departure from normalcy. It was one configuration in a long sequence of configurations, each driven by the same orbital arithmetic, each producing its own version of the African landscape, each eventually giving way to the next. The orbital precession cycle that created the African Humid Period is at this moment in a different phase. The northern hemisphere summer insolation is not at a maximum. The monsoon sits at its modern southern limit. The Sahara is dry. These facts are as impersonal as the orbital mechanics that produce them. They are simply the current state of a system that has no state more natural or more correct than any other, only states more or less favorable to the particular forms of life that happen to be present at a given moment. In 11,000 years, the precession cycle will have brought the configuration back towards something resembling the early Holocene maximum. Whether that will produce another humid period, and how much warming of other kinds will have altered the system by that point, or questions that the current science is actively trying to answer and that the current evidence cannot yet fully resolve. But these are present concerns. The story held in the sediment core, the story written in dark organic layers, in pale mineral silt, in pollen and in isotope ratios, in the chemistry of ancient rain, is a past one, and the past it records is one of the most striking reversals in the natural history of the African continent, a transformation from desert to garden and back again, accomplished not through any human action and not through any drama, but through the slow and patient turning of the planet itself, around its own slightly tilted axis. The pollen recovered from the dark layers of those cores is not particularly dramatic to look at. Under a microscope, individual pollen grains appear as small, geometrically precise objects, spherical or ovoid, their surfaces ornamented with ridges and pores that are characteristic of the plant species that produce them. A trained palynologist, a researcher who specializes in the study of pollen, can identify these grains to genus and sometimes to species, and by counting the relative abundance of different pollen types in successive layers of a core, can reconstruct the vegetation that was growing in the surrounding landscape at the time each layer was deposited. From cores taken at sites across the Sahara, these counts tell a consistent story. Grasses of the family Poaceae, the typical vegetation of savanna environments, were present far north of their modern range. Pollen of acacia, the thorny tree that today marks the northern edge of the African savanna, appears at latitudes where nothing but sand now exists. The pollen of aquatic plants, species that grow only in standing water, that require lakes and marshes and slow-moving rivers to complete their life cycles, appears in the lower layers of cores from basins that today are among the driest places on Earth. These pollen grains are, in a practical sense, the most direct evidence available for the vegetation of a world that left no other written record of itself. They are not reconstructions or models. They are physical objects, the actual reproductive cells of plants that grew in the Sahara during the African Humid Period, preserved in anoxic lake sediment for thousands of years, drawn to the surface in a steel tube, extracted in a laboratory, and counted one by one under a microscope. Their presence in a specific layer of sediment at a specific depth is a fact, not an inference. What the fact means, what vegetation community those pollen grains represent, what climate those plants require, is the inference, and it rests on a substantial body of comparative knowledge built from modern plant communities and their modern climatic conditions. But the grains themselves are real. They have survived the entire span of recorded human history, the rise and fall of every civilization on Earth, the passing of 10,000 years, sealed in mud that was once the floor of a lake no one alive today has ever seen. In the Saharan region of Algeria, there is a field research station that sits at the edge of an erg, a sea of sand dunes, where the ground is flat and pale, and the horizon is perfectly level in every direction. The station is modest, a tent or a collection of tents depending on the season, with folding tables bearing sample bags and notebooks and small containers of sealed sediment. In the early morning, before the heat has built to its midday intensity, the sand is perfectly still. The light at that hour is low and pale, and the shadows of the tent ropes lie precise and dark against the ground. The researchers at those tables are sorting through material collected from interdune hollows and deflated basins, places where the wind has removed the overlying sand and exposed older deposits beneath, where the surface layer is not dune sand, but lake mud or alluvial gravel, where the very ground under a researcher's boots was once the floor of a Saharan lake or the bank of a Saharan river. These moments of fieldwork, the early morning hours at a folding table, sample bags laid out in the still heat, the surrounding sand, precisely what it appears to be, and nothing more, are what connect the abstract mechanics of orbital precession to the physical reality of a vanished world. The data produced in those field camps will eventually become numbers on a printed data sheet, oxygen isotope values in a narrow academic typeface, pollen counts in a column of figures. But before they are any of that, they are this: sediment in a bag, pulled from the ground at a specific place on a specific morning in a desert that was once a garden and that holds the chemistry of that garden in its mineral grains, sealed and still and patient. The Lake Chad that exists today is a shallow, brackish body of water in the Sahel of West Africa, and even that diminished presence is under continuous pressure from the demands placed on it by the surrounding population and by the drying trend that has characterized the Sahelian climate across recent decades. Photographed from a satellite, the modern lake appears as a pale smear of water ringed by exposed mudflat, its color the color of very dilute tea, its outlines irregular and shifting from season to season. The ancient shoreline of Paleolake Megachad, the enormous body of water that formed in this basin during the African Humid Period, lies hundreds of kilometers distant from the modern waterline, across flat, featureless Sahelian plain. The wave-cut terraces and beach ridges that mark that ancient shoreline are still identifiable to researchers who know how to look for them. Horizontal features in a landscape that has very few horizontal features. Lines etched into pale rock at elevations that once corresponded to the surface of an inland sea. The modern lake's presence in the same basin where that enormous body of water once stood is, from a certain perspective, a kind of distant echo, the same geological structure still collecting the same monsoon rainfall, but in much smaller quantities, producing a much smaller result. The proxy data that document the North Atlantic's Holocene temperature history. The oxygen isotope records extracted from foraminifera in ocean sediment cores are themselves a kind of time capsule. Each value in those long columns of numbers represents the isotopic composition of a shell built by a microscopic organism that lived its entire life in the surface waters of the ocean at some specific point in the past, and then died and settled to the seafloor, and was buried and compressed into the sediment, and remained there, undisturbed, until a drill core was lowered from a research vessel and drew it back to the surface. The measurement of its shell chemistry is a measurement of ancient ocean temperature. The compilation of thousands of such measurements into a single record is a reconstruction of the ocean's thermal history across the Holocene, and that reconstruction, when placed alongside the records of Saharan lake levels and vegetation composition, shows that the two systems, the ocean and the continental atmosphere, were moving together across this period, coupled in the way that two components of a single mechanism are coupled, not independently, but as parts of the same operation. The Sahara that exists now is, by the reckoning of the sediment record, only a few thousand years old in its current extreme form. The intensely arid conditions of the present central and northern Sahara developed primarily after about 5,500 years ago, with much of the drying concentrated in the period between 6,000 and 4,500 years before the present. Before that, for at least 5,000 years, the landscape was different in ways that require a substantial effort of imagination to grasp from the vantage point of the present. The rock and sand that now extend, uninterrupted, for thousands of kilometers in every direction from the center of the desert, were, in that earlier time, covered with grass, interrupted by trees, cut through by rivers, pooled into lakes. The air above that landscape held moisture. Rain fell on it in season. Animals moved through it in numbers that the modern desert cannot support. And above the rain and the grass and the animals, the same mechanism that had created the conditions for all of it was continuing its slow, patient, completely indifferent turn. The axis precessing, the orbit shifting, the summer insolation declining, fraction by fraction, as the cycle moved past its peak. At dusk, seen from directly above, the modern Sahara is a surface of extraordinary color. The ochre and rose and pale gold of the sand respond to the low-angle light of evening with an intensity that seems almost luminous, as though the ground itself were generating the color rather than merely reflecting it. The surface, from that altitude, is smooth in some places, the great flat sand sheets where nothing interrupts the wind, and textured in others, where the dunes rise in long, regular ridges, casting shadow bands across the intervening corridors. It is vast in the specific way that only deserts and oceans are vast, not merely large, but uniform enough across its extent that scale becomes difficult to register, that the eye finds no anchor in the middle distance and lets go of the effort to measure what it sees. Somewhere beneath that surface, beneath the sand and the rock and the accumulated dust of thousands of years of deflation and deposition, the chemistry of ancient rain persists in mineral grains that have not been touched by sunlight since the Middle Holocene. The calcium and magnesium and carbonate that precipitated out of lake water 6,000 or 7,000 years ago are still there, locked into the crystal structure of minerals that formed at the bottom of lakes that no longer exist. The organic carbon of decomposed plant material is still there, compressed into dark laminae in sediment beds lying meters below the sand surface. The pollen grains of savanna grasses are still there, preserved, intact, waiting in their anoxic seal for a drill core, or a deflating wind, or some other contingency to bring them back into contact with the air they were shed into thousands of years ago. These are not metaphors. They are physical facts about what the Saharan subsurface contains, verifiable by any researcher with the equipment and the patience to extract a core and examine its contents. The record persists because the conditions for its preservation are met. The sediment is buried, the chemistry is stable, the grains are sealed from the processes of oxidation and biological decay that would otherwise break them down. The green world that produced them has been gone for several thousand years, but its chemistry is still there, held in the mineral fabric of a desert that does not know what it was, waiting in the dark beneath a surface that glows ochre and rose in the evening light, still and vast and quiet, as the slow machinery of the planet continues its turn. A pale ridge of rounded pebbles crosses the flat floor of the Chadian lowlands, like a sentence written in a language that took decades to read. The stones are small, thumbnail-sized, the largest no bigger than a clenched fist, and they are smooth in the particular way that only sustained tumbling and moving water produces, their surfaces worn to a soft matte finish by a friction that the surrounding desert has not known for thousands of years. Standing on that ridge at ground level, the eye moves outward across the basin in every direction and finds nothing that rises, nothing that interrupts the flat, pale distance. The depression extends to the horizon and beyond. Beneath that flat surface, beneath the cracked clay and the wind-deposited silt, lies the floor of what was once one of the largest bodies of fresh water the African continent has ever held, a lake so vast that the modern mind reaches for comparison and finds only open ocean, Paleolake Mega-Chad, at its maximum extent during the African Humid Period, covered an estimated 400,000 square kilometers. That figure does not resolve easily into any familiar frame of reference. The modern Caspian Sea, the largest lake on Earth by any current measurement, stretches to roughly 370,000 square kilometers in surface area, and Mega-Chad, at its peak, exceeded even that. Where the empty Chadian lowlands lie today, where the cracked clay flats of the modern Lake Chad's shrinking margins extend, there was once open water deep enough to generate its own weather, its own wave action, its own internal circulation. The beach ridge underfoot is evidence of that depth, a line of accumulated gravel and rounded stone pushed by waves to a consistent elevation, then abandoned when the water level finally fell and did not return. Such ridges do not form in shallow or temporary water. They require sustained fetch, sustained wind, sustained depth. They require, in short, a real lake. The wave-cut terraces that mark Mega-Chad's ancient shorelines have been identified across the arid lowlands of Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon. Horizontal lines etched into pale rock and sediment at consistent elevations above the modern basin floor, each one a register of a level the lake once held for long enough to leave a permanent mark. Geomorphologists reading these features move across the landscape, the way a librarian moves through a stacked archive, identifying each terrace as a chapter in a volume whose narrative runs backward through time. The deeper the terrace sits below the highest mark, the highest and oldest shorelines record the lake at its maximum. The lower ones record successive retreats, some gradual, some apparently rapid, each abandonment leaving its signature in gravel and carved stone before the next wet phase refilled the basin to a different level. That sequence, rise, plateau, fall, partial rise, final withdrawal, is written in the landscape itself, legible to anyone who knows what the shape of a shoreline looks like when it has been left behind by water. The basin that Mega Chad occupied did not drain in the way a bathtub drains. There was no outlet that opened and let the water out. The lake shrank primarily through evaporation, the slow continuous loss of water to a sky that was receiving less monsoon moisture as the orbital conditions that had created the African Humid Period gradually shifted. Evaporation is an invisible process. It leaves no mark of its own. What it leaves behind as the water level drops is the record the lake itself had been building, the shoreline features, the wave-cut bench, the beach ridge of rounded stone, each one exposed to air and light and wind for the first time as the surface retreats. The ridge underfoot in the Chadian lowlands has been above water since the lake receded past this elevation. That recession, depending on the specific terrace, occurred somewhere between roughly 8,000 and 4,000 years ago. The stones have been dry since then. They have been sitting in the same positions, settling gradually into the sediment surface since the Holocene was still young, and the last communities living beside the lake's retreating margins were still fishing its shallowing waters. The extent of Mega Chad is not the only dimension that demands attention. The lake's biological productivity, the richness of what lived in it and around it, was a direct function of its size, its stability, and the inputs it received from the rivers and streams that fed it across a vast watershed. A lake of 400,000 square kilometers does not sit in isolation. It generates a gravitational pull on the hydrology of everything around it, drawing drainage from catchments hundreds of kilometers distant, sustaining river systems that would otherwise have been too small and too seasonal to maintain permanent flow. The rivers that fed Mega Chad during the African Humid Period left their own records in the landscape, records that in some cases did not become fully legible until the late 20th century, when technology provided a way of seeing beneath the desert surface itself. In the early 1980s, the Space Shuttle imaging radar missions operated by NASA returned data that changed the understanding of the Eastern Sahara in a single season of analysis. The radar signals used in those missions, wavelengths long enough to penetrate the surface layer of dry, compacted sand, reached the sediment beneath and reflected differently depending on what they encountered. Where the sand covered old river gravels and alluvial deposits, the reflected signal was distinctive. When researchers processed and printed the false color radar images for missions conducted in 1981, what appeared on the paper was a network of dark sinuous lines moving beneath the bright radar reflective surface of the Saharan sand sheets in Egypt and Sudan. Those lines were buried river channels, ancient valleys. The alluvial gravels and lacustrine muds that formed their beds and margins had been confirmed through ground-truthing expeditions that followed the imagery to represent sustained flowing water active across centuries to millennia during the humid period. A printed copy of one of those radar images, the kind that circulated in academic departments in the early 1980s, creased from folding, sometimes annotated in ballpoint pen by whichever researcher had been working with it, shows the buried channels as branching dark lines that cross and rejoin, the characteristic geometry of a fluvial system moving across flat terrain. The surface visible in the same image is bright and featureless, sand apparently empty, but the buried channels beneath it record a different landscape, one in which rivers moved across what is now one of the most arid regions on Earth, carrying water from rain-fed highlands toward the lowland lakes, depositing alluvial material along their banks, and sustaining a corridor of moisture through the continental interior. The researcher who first marked those branching lines in ballpoint pen, noting their sinuosity and their extent was doing something not entirely unlike what the geomorphologist does, standing on the beach ridge in the Chadian lowlands, reading the landscape for a record it has been holding in silence. The radar imagery confirmed something that surface evidence had suggested, but not fully established. The eastern Sahara's buried drainage systems were not local features, not isolated relics of brief wet episodes. They were the remnants of integrated river networks operating at regional scale, connecting upland catchments to lowland lake basins across distances that made the entire system a single hydrological unit during the African Humid Period. Water fell on highland terrain, moved through rivers toward the interior, collected in basins like Megachad, evaporated into an atmosphere that carried it back toward the land as monsoon moisture, and fell again. The cycle was not closed with the tidiness of a textbook diagram, but the general principle held. A wetter Sahara was a Sahara in which water moved, accumulated, and remained long enough to sustain landscapes that required it. What grew in those landscapes is a question that pollen has answered with a patience and a precision that no other method has matched. Pollen grains are chemically resistant, their outer walls composed of a substance called sporopollenin that survives burial in sediment for thousands of years without significant degradation. Every plant produces pollen of a distinctive shape, and every grain that falls into a lake or a waterlogged depression settles to the floor and is eventually buried by subsequent sediment, where it remains in sequence, the deepest layers the oldest, the shallowest the most recent. Extracting a sediment core from such a deposit and identifying the pollen at each level produces a vertical time series of the vegetation that surrounded the water body, a botanical record of what was growing, decade by decade and century by century as the climate shifted. Pollen records from Saharan paleolake sites have confirmed in systematic botanical detail what the landscape features alone could only suggest in outline. At Paleolake Yoa in Chad, pollen sequences running from the peak of the African Humid Period through its termination document, the northward expansion of Sahalo-Sudanian savanna vegetation into regions that are today featureless sand, desert. The family Poaceae, the grasses in the broadest sense, dominates the humid period pollen assemblages in proportions that confirm an open grassland structure similar to the modern Sahel, but extended hundreds of kilometers further north and west than that biome currently reaches. Among the grass pollen, grains from acacia and busca, generous shrubs and small trees, characteristic of dryland African savannas, appear consistently in the humid period layers, confirming that the grasslands were not treeless but carried a scattered woody component, the structure of a wooded savanna rather than a pure herbaceous plain. The cross-section of a pollen core from Yoa, printed in a published stratigraphic diagram, runs its depth axis down the page with the most recent sediment at the top and the oldest at the bottom. The pollen columns, one for each identified taxon, their widths proportional to that taxon's abundance at each level, shift in character as the depth increases toward the humid period peak. Near the bottom, the grass and acacia columns are wide. Near the top, in the levels that correspond to the drying that followed the African Humid Period, the columns narrow, and the taxa that indicate open desert conditions bear mineral grains. The pollen of drought-adapted plants begin to dominate. The transition is visible. It does not happen in a single layer, but the direction is unmistakable, and the record captures it without commentary, without inflection, in the simple widths and narrowings of its pollen-type columns. Grasses and acacia do not require permanent water bodies. They can sustain themselves in a landscape that receives reliable seasonal rainfall, even when that rainfall is followed by a dry season of several months. But pollen records from Saharan sites also preserve the signature of a different kind of vegetation, plants that require not just seasonal rainfall, but access to sustained moisture along river banks and lake margins. The gallery forests of the African Humid Period were narrow bands of denser, taller tree cover that followed the courses of rivers and the edges of lakes, threading through the savanna matrix along the waterways that sustained them. Botanical and pollen evidence identifies genera, including Combertum and Terminalia, among the trees of these gallery systems, along with relatives of the fig, plants that in the modern African landscape cluster along watercourses and in seasonally flooded depressions, marking the presence of subsurface or surface water with the precision of biological indicators that have no reason to mislead. Gallery forests function in a landscape as corridors, a species that cannot cross open savanna, a tree-dependent bird, an insect tied to the microclimate of dense canopy shade, an animal that requires the structural complexity of forest edge, can nevertheless move along a river's gallery strip from one lake basin to another, from one watershed to the next, without ever leaving the conditions it requires. During the African Humid Period, when rivers connected the interior of the Sahara to the margins of the Sahel and the Mediterranean, those gallery corridors allowed ecological movement at continental scale. Species that were unable to cross the modern Sahara's barriers dispersed across it when the landscape was threaded with forest-lined rivers. The pollen record captures only the plants that formed those corridors. What moved through them is a question that other evidence, bones, molecular genetics, biogeographic distributions, must answer in its own time and in its own register. Between the grasses and acacias of the savanna interior and the gallery forests along the waterways, the green Sahara's vegetation was not uniform. It was a mosaic, spatially varied, structured by local topography and the distribution of permanent water, shifting gradually across latitude from denser wooded conditions near the lake margins to more open grassland toward the upland fringe. Rocky outcrops, plateaus, and highlands carried their own botanical communities, sheltered from the full force of the dry season wind and collecting additional moisture from mist and condensation on their elevated surfaces. It was in some of these refugia, protected pockets of favorable microclimate in the rock, that certain plants survived after the broader humid period conditions had retreated, persisting in isolated populations into the present. The Tassili Niger Plateau in southern Algeria occupies a raised sandstone massif above the surrounding erg, its surface dissected by canyons and ravines that cut down into the rock and hold, at their bottoms, conditions very different from the plateau surface above. The canyon floors receive runoff from the surrounding rock, accumulate fine sediment that retains what moisture does fall, and are shielded from the drying wind by their walls. In some of these sheltered ravines, relict plant populations have survived into the present, living remnants of a botanical community that was far more widespread during the African Humid Period. The Saharan cypress, known formally as Cupressus dupresiana, grows in isolated specimens in the ravines and sheltered rock faces of the Tassili, a gray-barked tree whose fibrous texture and narrow growth form are adapted to the conditions of the Mediterranean and temperate vegetation communities that once extended far across North Africa during the wetter Holocene. There are fewer than 200 surviving trees. Each one grows in a crack in the rock or in a canyon floor where moisture persists below the surface long after the last rain has dried from the surrounding stone. A single Saharan cypress in its ravine on the Tassili Niger Plateau stands with its gray bark pressed against pale sandstone in the particular way that trees growing in rock adopt, not the vertical straightness of a tree with easy access to soil, but a slight lean, an accommodation to the surface that offered the only available purchase for roots that had to reach moisture at whatever angle the rock permitted. The needles are still green. That fact, stated plainly, contains the entire story of what a refugium is and what it preserves: life, in the specific form it took in a different climate, surviving into a climate that cannot support it anywhere beyond the precise microhabitat that replicates in miniature and in shelter the conditions that once prevailed across a continent. The Saharan myrtle is another relic present in sheltered tessellate locations, a small-leaved aromatic shrub whose broader distribution during the African Humid Period extended across Mediterranean North Africa and deep into the Saharan interior along the river corridors and lake margins. In the ravines of the Tali, it persists in populations that have been effectively isolated since the surrounding desert made the distances between one refugium and the next impassable. The individuals alive in any given ravine are, in the broadest biological sense, living records of the community that thrived when those ravines were not exceptional, when the green world's vegetation extended across the plateau and beyond, when the Saharan myrtle did not need a sheltered crack in the rock to find enough moisture to survive. Those plants grew in the open landscape alongside the grasses and the acacias and the gallery trees along the riverbanks. The canyon refugia are what remains when the open landscape is no longer available. The evidence for gallery forests, savanna grasses, and acacia woodland across the African Humid Period Sahara does not come only from pollen. Satellite radar confirmed buried river channels beneath the sand. Geomorphological survey confirmed lake shorelines across the lowland basins. But in some cases, the botanical record is supplemented by something even more direct: the physical remains of plants themselves, preserved in the dry conditions that now characterize the sediment layers where they once grew. Waterlogged wood fragments, seed capsules, and root structures have been recovered from contexts in the Saharan interior that place them firmly within the humid period, confirming that what the pollen recorded as grains was once expressed in the full physical form of living plants, rooted in mud beside a lake, or leaning over a slow-moving river on a landscape that no longer exists in any form the present can observe from ground level. The word buried applies in multiple senses to what the Saharan landscape holds. There is the literal burial, the lake sediments and river alluvium lying beneath sand sheets and deflated interdune hollows, the rounded river cobbles collected from depressions in the Libyan Sahara and laid out in field camps by researchers who carry them hundreds of kilometers from any modern watercourse. The smooth, water-worn stones that could only have acquired their shape in a current that has not flowed in that location for several thousand years. Those cobbles, sitting in the palm of the hand, have the weight and temperature of any rounded stone, and no sensory quality that would distinguish them from pebbles pulled from a modern riverbed. The difference is entirely one of context, the sediment they came from, the distance from any living river, the date established by the surrounding matrix of datable material. They are physically unremarkable. Their story is entirely in where they were found. There is also burial in a subtler sense, the way the record of the humid period is distributed across a landscape that has been subsequently reshaped by thousands of years of wind erosion, deposition, and reworking. Deflation, the process by which wind removes fine material from a surface and leaves behind coarser lag deposits, concentrates artifacts and ecofacts on surfaces that have lost the sedimentary context in which they were originally embedded. A collection of rounded river cobbles on a modern interdune surface may once have formed part of a thick alluvial deposit, now reduced by wind erosion to a pavement of lag material on a deflated floor. The pebbles are still there. The record they were embedded in has, in many locations, been thinned or scattered by the same wind processes that are still active across the Saharan surface today. The researchers who work in this landscape carry that awareness into their methodology, knowing that what appears on the surface has been rearranged by processes active since the green world ended, that the spatial relationships between objects found in lag contexts do not necessarily reflect the spatial relationships they originally held in their depositional environment. This is why sediment cores and intact stratigraphic sections, when they can be found, carry a weight of evidence that surface collections cannot fully replicate. The layered sediment column is a record that the rearranging processes have not yet reached, sealed beneath enough overburden to have survived the millennia of wind and erosion above it, its layers still in sequence, its pollen still in place at the depths where it fell, its organic material still available for dating. In a research camp pitched at the edge of an Algerian erg on a still morning before the heat fully establishes itself, sample bags and sediment containers from the previous day's coring work sit on a folding table, waiting for labeling and processing. The contents of each tube, extracted cores of lacustrine sediment that will eventually travel to a laboratory and be subsampled at centimeter intervals for pollen analysis and geochemical processing, hold, within their clay and organic material, a version of the botanical history described above. The researcher moving between the table and the notes knows that the striped columns of sediment in each tube correspond to periods of the Saharan past that will take months of laboratory work to characterize, and that the characterization, when it is complete, will add a location, a time series, and a set of species identifications to an archive that is assembled one core at a time, across decades, by the accumulation of individual field seasons conducted in conditions that do not invite leisurely work. The broader record built from that accumulation, site by site, core by core, pollen assemblage by pollen assemblage, describes a Saharan interior that was, during the African Humid Period, a genuinely living landscape, not a landscape on the margins of habitability, not a landscape that flickered briefly into productivity before retreating, a landscape of lakes large enough to generate their own wave action, a landscape of rivers that buried alluvial gravels beneath what is now open sand, revealed only when a radar beam long enough to penetrate the surface finally reached the deposits beneath and reflected differently than the surrounding matrix. A landscape of savanna grasses and acacia and gallery forests lining the watercourses and connecting one lake basin to another across the continental interior. A landscape in which Mediterranean and temperate plant communities extended south and east from the margins of the modern range, leaving behind, in sheltered ravines, the isolated populations that now represent their last local expression. That last phrase, last local expression, might carry a weight of ending. The style of the material, consulted honestly, does not quite support the weight. The Saharan cypress in its ravine on the Tassili is not ending, it is growing. The gray bark is pressed against the pale sandstone, and the needles are green, and the roots are in contact with moisture somewhere below the canyon floor that the surrounding desert does not know is there. The tree does not experience its isolation. It does not know that there are fewer than 200 of its kind on the plateau, or that the landscape that once supported a wider community of its relatives has long since been replaced by something the tree's physiology was not adapted for. It simply grows at the rate that trees and its conditions grow, slowly, with the patience of something that does not measure time by the standards that matter to other kinds of organism. The Saharan myrtle beside it, in the same ravine, or the one adjacent, also grows. The moisture in the canyon floor also persists, available to whatever roots can reach it. The rock walls that shelter the canyon from the drying wind are the same rock walls that sheltered it from the drying wind throughout the African Humid Period's termination. As the monsoon retreated south, decade by decade, and the vegetation community that once covered the surrounding plateau was progressively reduced to the isolated pockets where local conditions maintained what the regional climate could no longer provide. Rounded river cobbles in a deflated hollow in the Libyan Sahara, pollen grains of Sahalo-Sudanian grasses in a sediment core from Paleo Lake Yoa, ancient shoreline terraces running in horizontal lines across the pale rock of the Chadian lowlands, false color radar images showing sinuous dark lines beneath the bright surface of the eastern Saharan sand sheets, their buried channels recorded in alluvial gravel. These are the physical materials from which the description above is assembled, not imagination, not extrapolation beyond what the evidence permits, but a reading of the record that the landscape has been holding in its sediment, in its stone, in its surviving biology since the green world was still retreating. The sediment beneath the Saharan surface does not change with the decades since the cores were extracted. The pollen in the layers from 9,000 years ago is the same pollen that was identified when the cores were first processed, and it will be the same pollen when the cores are reanalyzed as they periodically are, with improved identification techniques that can distinguish taxa the earlier methods could not separate. The buried river channels beneath the sand sheets in Egypt and Sudan are still there in the same positions with the same alluvial gravels in their beds, whether or not anyone is currently working in that region with ground-penetrating instrumentation. The wave-cut terraces on the Chadian lowlands have not moved since the water that cut them last retreated past their elevation. The rounded pebbles in the interdune depressions of the Libyan Sahara are at this moment exactly where they have been for several thousand years, smooth, water-worn, indifferent to the wind moving over them and the sand shifting around their edges in the slow erg-scale motion of an active dune field. And in a sheltered ravine on the Tassili Nasher Plateau, in a crack in the pale sandstone where the canyon wall angles inward and the afternoon shade arrives early, the Saharan cypress grows in the particular stillness of a plant in its own time. Its roots reach downward into moisture that does not announce itself at the surface. Its needles carry on with the chemistry of photosynthesis and respiration that they have been conducting in that location since before the last of the green world's broader community was still retreating from the surrounding plateau. It has been growing in that cleft since the savanna grasses that once covered the plateau above were still thinning year by year as the monsoon withdrew, since the acacia trees along the ancient river corridors were still alive but no longer reproducing as the soil dried around their roots, since the lake basins in the lowlands below were still shrinking and the beach ridges and terraces that the waves had cut into the rock were being exposed one by one to the dry air of a climate already becoming the climate the region holds today. Through all of that, the cypress in the ravine simply grew. It grew unhurried and unrecorded. It is growing still. A hippopotamus molar tooth rests in a shallow museum tray in the storage room of a natural history institute in Niamey, on a shelf among hundreds of other trays, each holding something that should not, by any reasonable expectation, exist where it was found. The tooth is large. It is cream-colored, ridged across its grinding surface in the way that the molars of large browsing mammals are ridged, worn in places where decades of chewing had pressed grass and bark and aquatic vegetation into its enamel. A small paper label, handwritten in a careful museum hand, is tucked beside it in the tray, recording a site name, a depth in meters, a stratum designation. The site name is a location in the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert is among the most arid places on the surface of the earth. That tooth was not carried there. It was not deposited there by human hands in any recent century. It was found in lake sediment, in the same dark organic rich matrix that forms at the bottom of standing, permanent, productive bodies of water, the kind of mud that accumulates slowly over generations of biological activity, binding the chemical signatures of rainfall and warmth and biological abundance into fine-grained layers that hold their record for thousands of years. The tooth was in that mud because the animal whose mouth it once occupied was alive at the edge of a lake in a place that has not seen standing water in 6,000 years. It was there because the Sahara was, for a long period, a landscape entirely different from the one that exists above it now, a landscape of lakes and rivers and grass and shade, a landscape of large, slow animals moving through shallow water at the margins of permanent lakes, and the tooth in its labeled tray is one of the quieter, more concrete pieces of evidence that this is true. The common hippopotamus, Hippopotamus amphibius, is not an animal that survives on marginal water. Its biology requires something specific, permanent, deep, accessible bodies of water, large enough that a group of animals can submerge themselves through the heat of the day, and surrounded by enough vegetation that the same animals can graze across several kilometers every night. A hippopotamus population cannot be sustained by seasonal pools. It cannot persist beside water that dries for even a few months of the year. Its presence in a sediment layer is in this sense a kind of hydrological argument, a claim made in bone and tooth enamel about the nature of the water that existed at that place when the animal was alive. The fossil record of Hippopotamus amphibius in the Sahara, in Algeria, Libya, Chad, Niger, across the entire breadth of a region that today receives less than 5 millimeters of annual rainfall in most places, is not a claim made by a single specimen. It is a claim distributed across dozens of sites, dozens of sediment contexts, dozens of excavations conducted across several decades by researchers working independently in different parts of the desert, all arriving at the same quiet, remarkable conclusion. The lakes were real. They were deep enough and large enough and permanent enough to sustain hippopotamus populations. And the hippopotamus was not the only thing living in them. At Gobero, a dried paleolake site in the Tenere region of Niger, excavations yielded the bones of a fish, not a small fish. The fish in question was Late Niloticus, the Nile perch, a species that reaches 200 kilograms in adulthood, a species that requires large, well-oxygenated, stable bodies of water to sustain itself through its life cycle. A Nile perch does not live in a seasonal puddle. It does not survive in a shrinking pool. The vertebrae and jaw fragments from Gobero's sediment layers are the fossil evidence of a functioning aquatic ecosystem, a lake deep enough and stable enough across enough years that a population of very large fish could live out generations in its water. The same layers contain the bones of catfish and tilapia, species that together paint a picture of a warm, productive, well-stocked freshwater environment that would have looked, to anyone standing at its edge, something like the shores of the modern Nile or Lake Turkana. The labeled specimen tray from the Gobero excavation, fish vertebrae, ribs, the partial jaw of a Nile perch lying in the dark sediment matrix still adhering to the largest fragments, the bones themselves bleached white, by years in the archive, is a document of a specific kind. It does not argue abstractly for the existence of the Green Sahara. It holds it in material form. The jaw of a 200-kilogram fish from one of the driest places on Earth is not a proposition. It is a fact that does not require interpretation so much as it requires attention, a willingness to sit with the strangeness of what the sediment was keeping and what it has now given back. Nile crocodiles were in those lakes as well. Their bones appear at Saharan Paleo-lake sites alongside the fish they would have eaten and the mammals they would have shared the water margins with. The crocodile is an animal that reads at the geological scale, something like the hippopotamus, a reliable indicator of permanent water, of stable thermal conditions, of an ecosystem complex enough to support a large reptile predator through its full life cycle. Crocodile bones and Saharan sediment are a record of abundance, of the kind of ecological completeness that a landscape achieves only when it has been wet for long enough, that every niche has been filled and every food chain has been established from the bottom upward. But the crocodile left behind something more than bones. In the Tagant Plateau of Mauritania, in a region that today receives almost no annual rainfall, researchers identified a surviving population of small crocodiles living in isolated rock pools, not fossils, living animals. The discovery confirmed what the sediment record implied, that crocodile populations had once extended across the entire breadth of the humid Sahara, linked by rivers and lakes and seasonal wetlands into a single interconnected aquatic community, and that when the water retreated, some of those populations were stranded in the pockets of moisture that remained. The Tagant crocodiles are, in a biological sense, marooned. They live in the only water available within many tens of kilometers in any direction. Their population is small. The rock pool they inhabit at dusk, its surface perfectly still in the cooling air, the dark shape of a motionless crocodile visible just below the waterline, the surrounding plateau dry and pale and windless, is all that remains in that particular place of the aquatic landscape that once stretched continuously from the Nile to the Atlantic. There is something unhurried about a crocodile at the bottom of a rock pool. It is an animal that has always waited, that measures its biological time in ways that have nothing to do with the urgency of warmer-blooded creatures. The Tagant crocodiles have been waiting in their pools since the surrounding landscape dried, waiting without any apparent awareness that the world they are adapted for has receded, waiting with the patient and entirely unconscious persistence of things that have nowhere else to go and no particular awareness that this constitutes a kind of solitude. They are simply there as they have been there through the intervening millennia in the water still. African elephants were in the Green Sahara too. Their molars and limb bones have been found in lake sediment contexts at sites including Gobero, confirming the presence of populations that have since been gone from the region for thousands of years. The elephant is an animal that requires vast quantities of both water and vegetation. A mature elephant drinks somewhere between 100 and 200 liters of water a day and forages across areas measured in dozens of square kilometers. An elephant population in the Central Sahara is not a marginal or provisional thing. It is evidence of a landscape so thoroughly transformed from its present state that the two, the place the elephant required and the place the Sahara is now, are effectively impossible to reconcile with one another without the sediment record sitting between them as a bridge. The rock art confirms this in a different register. Across the walls and overhangs of the Tassili Niger Plateau in Algeria, across the Akapis Mountains of Libya, across the cliff faces of the Adra de Ifahaz in Mali, and the Air Mountains of Niger, Engraved and painted elephants appear in their hundreds. They are depicted with the anatomical knowledge of people who had observed living animals at close range. The shape of the ear, the set of the eye, the particular posture of a large animal moving through grass. For a long time, this rock art was interpreted by some researchers as purely symbolic, as animals that held cosmological significance but not ecological presence. The bone record from Gobero and other sites settled that question. The people who painted elephants on Saharan rock faces were painting the animals they knew. The paintings are ethnographic as much as they are artistic. They are the record of a living landscape deposited on its own walls. The giraffe appears in that landscape too, rendered at a scale that has no parallel in any other ancient animal engraving on Earth. The Dabas giraffe petroglyph in Niger is approximately 6 meters tall from the animal's feet to the top of its head. It was carved into pale sandstone in a region where no giraffe has lived for thousands of years. Its lines incised with a patience and precision that suggests the carvers had access to extended observation of the living animal, the proportion of neck to body, the angle of the ossicones, the particular stance of an animal at rest versus an animal in motion. Photographed at low-angle morning light, the carved lines cast sharp shadows across the pale sandstone surface, deepening the relief and making the animal's form resolve out of the rock with a quality that shifts slightly depending on where the light falls. The neck rises 6 meters from the animal's feet in precise, unhurried detail. A 6-meter giraffe carved into a rock face in a desert where no giraffe now lives is a statement about ecological reality. It is a statement that requires, for its full meaning to be available, the sediment record and the bone record and the fish vertebrae in their labeled trays, all of it together, constituting a world that the rock art is a document of, a world that the carvers knew, not because they had been told about it or because they were imagining something they had never seen, but because they were living in it when they raised the tools that made those lines. The landscape those animals moved through was, at its peak, something between an open savanna and a well-watered grassland, with gallery forests running along river banks and lake margins, with acacia and fig relatives and Saharan cypress growing in the places where the soil held moisture longest, hippopotamus in the lakes, crocodiles and Nile perch in the rivers, elephants moving through the grasslands, giraffes at the browse margins, feeding from trees that existed in their thousands, where now there is only sand, aurochs, wild cattle, the ancestors of domesticated breeds, crossing the upland plateaus, Barbary sheep, which still survive in small numbers in the most inaccessible Saharan massifs, moving through terrain that was once continuous habitat rather than the isolated refugia they now inhabit. The species list from a published faunal analysis of a Saharan paleolake site runs down a column in the kind of narrow academic typeface that research publications favor: hippopotamus, Nile crocodile, elephant, giraffe, Nile perch, aurochs, Barbary sheep, each entry a simple notation, a species name accompanied by a site code and a stratigraphic designation, and each one, in its aggregate, describing a world that the eye cannot confirm from the surface of the modern Sahara. The sediment tells it differently than the rock art does. The bone record tells it differently than the sediment does. The relict population in its rock pool tells it differently than the petroglyph does. Each line of evidence is a separate access point to the same underlying reality, and that reality is one of the most dramatic ecological transformations documented in the quaternary record, a transformation in one direction, and then the same transformation in reverse, and all of it accomplished by the slow, impersonal adjustment of the planet's relationship to its own sun. The hippopotamus tooth in its museum tray was not alone in that storage room. There were other trays on the same shelf, and other shelves in the same room, and in a neighboring room and a neighboring corridor, the accumulation of decades of fieldwork across a region that most of the world still understands primarily as empty sand. The crocodile in its rock pool was not, by the time researchers identified it, unique in the scientific literature. It was the most famous of several similar discoveries that together describe a pattern of isolation and survival that echoes across the Saharan massifs, wherever conditions allowed a small pocket of moisture to persist long enough. The Dabas giraffe on its sandstone cliff was accompanied, at a distance of several meters, by a second giraffe and by human figures, and by animal tracks, and by all of the other imagery of a carved landscape that extended across the Niger's Aya region and beyond, as far as the memory of water and grass permitted people to work. None of these things were found together in a single place. The bone record comes from excavations. The relict populations come from biological surveys. The rock art comes from decades of documentation by researchers working in conditions of considerable difficulty, in heat and remoteness, at sites that required significant effort to reach. The coherence of the picture they produce is not an artifact of the way the evidence was gathered. It is a coherence that the evidence itself possesses, independently of any particular interpreter, a redundancy of confirmation that accumulates across different methods in different locations in different research traditions until the world it describes becomes simply undeniable. The world it describes was a world in motion. The animals in it were not fixed, not confined to territories bounded by the kinds of ecological limits that confine them now. A hippopotamus molar found in Algeria is evidence of a population that had moved westward across a landscape of connected lakes and rivers from populations further east, following the water as the water extended northward and westward with the monsoon. A Nile perch jaw in the Tenere is evidence of fish populations that had colonized interior lakes via river connections that no longer exist, dispersing into new territories as new water bodies formed and filled and stabilized. The crocodiles that are now stranded in Mauritanian rock pools were once part of a continuous Saharan crocodile community connected across the breadth of the humid zone. The giraffes that were carved on a cliff in Niger were part of populations that moved through a corridor of savanna vegetation extending from the Sahel northward into the interior of the continent, following the grass as the grass followed the rain. Movement was the condition of the Green Sahara's biological life. Everything in it was tracking the water. Everything in it was occupying the space that the water made available. And everything in it was, over the long, slow centuries of the humid period's tenure, finding the margins and establishing the communities and creating the ecological connections that made the interior of the continent, for that interval, as biologically rich as any other region of comparable area in Africa. The Sahara was not exotic or unusual in its green phase. It was participating in the same tropical and subtropical biological abundance that characterizes the continent's wetter regions today. The remarkable thing, the thing that the tooth in the tray and the crocodile in the pool and the giraffe on the cliff face all insist upon, is not that the Sahara was once green, but that it was green so recently and so completely, and has since become so entirely otherwise. The rock pool in the Tagant Plateau holds its water through the year. In the dry season, when the surrounding plateau is white and exposed, and the air carries the particular sharp quality of Saharan heat at its most concentrated. The pool surface lies still under the direct light, and the crocodile at the bottom is motionless in the way that crocodiles are motionless when they are not hunting, which is most of the time. It is not sleeping in any sense that maps onto what other animals do when they rest. It is in a state of patient, thermoregulated stillness that is simply what a crocodile is when it is not required to be anything else. The pool is small. It is contained within a shallow depression in the plateau rock, fed by a small seep that has persisted through the millennia of aridity because the bedrock in that particular place has kept the right geometry, the right porosity, the right drainage relationship with the deeper groundwater that the rainfall of the humid period recharged, and that has been slowly releasing its stored water since the last monsoon rains retreated from this latitude. The crocodile in the pool is in one frame of understanding a survivor. In another frame, it is simply an animal that has remained in the place where its ancestors were when the water began to shrink, maintaining the only life available to it within the constraints of the only habitat available to it, without any apparent orientation toward the past that produced its circumstances or the future that will eventually resolve them. It does not know that the lake it would have swum in 10,000 years ago extended to the horizon in every direction. It does not know that the hippopotamus bones in the museum tray in Niamey are a record of the world it is a remnant of. It knows the pool, it knows the seep, it knows the rock edges where it hauls itself out in the morning to absorb the first warmth of the day. At night, the pool is dark. The plateau around it is dark and windless. The sky above it a deep field of stars of the kind that only appear at this altitude and this distance from any human settlement. The crocodile is still at the bottom of the pool, in water that the darkness has allowed to cool slightly, and the surrounding plateau is dry and pale and entirely quiet. There is no sound from any direction that is not the specific silence of a very dry and very still place after the sun has gone. The water in the pool is the only water for many kilometers in every direction. The animal in the water is, in some precise and literal biological sense, the last of its kind in this particular place, a living fragment of a faunal community that the sediment record documents and the rock art confirms, and the bone collections of several African natural history museums preserve in labeled trays, and its stillness at the bottom of the pool, in the dark, is simply the ordinary stillness of an animal that has found, or more precisely remained within, the only circumstances in which it can persist. This is what the Green Sahara leaves behind in its biological legacy, not absence exactly, but the particular kind of presence that is produced by contraction, by the slow withdrawal of conditions that once permitted abundance, and the gradual resolution of that abundance into its most resilient components. The fish bones in the Gobero sediment are the remains of a community that required a lake to sustain itself and ceased when the lake ceased. The hippopotamus populations that left their teeth in Algerian and Libyan sediment layers required water that eventually could no longer be reached from the north, and they retreated southward or locally disappeared as the lakes shrank. The elephant populations left no relics in the Saharan Massif because an elephant requires too much water and too much vegetation to survive on the margins that the massifs preserved when the green world contracted. The giraffes left their image on the rock and nothing else. The crocodile left itself. There is a particular quality to the evidence the animals of the Green Sahara have provided. It is not the quality of drama or spectacle. The hippopotamus tooth in its tray does not announce itself. The crocodile in its pool does not perform its significance. The Nile perch jaw in the labeled specimen bag is simply a bone fragment with a site code attached, lying in the company of other bone fragments in a storage room that smells of old sediment and the particular neutral chemical odor of objects that have been cleaned and cataloged and shelved. The evidence is quiet, it is precise, it accumulates across institutions and research programs and decades of field work until the picture it forms is clear enough to require no embellishment, no dramatization, no insistence on its own strangeness. The Dabas giraffe on its sandstone cliff requires perhaps slightly more effort to encounter. The site is remote, the petroglyph is large. The shadow at low-angle morning light deepens the carved lines into something that has a quality of presence, a neck rising 6 meters from the sandstone in precise, patient detail, depicted by people who observed this animal at close range in a landscape where the grass was tall and the rain was seasonal and reliable. The world the carvers were in when they raised their tools was real. The giraffe they were depicting was real. The ecological connection between the place where they stood and the rest of the living continent was real, maintained by the water that connected the lakes and the rivers and the seasonal wetlands into a continuous corridor of viable habitat extending from the Sahel to the Mediterranean margins. All of that is recorded in the rock. Some of it is recorded in the bone. The most patient recording of all is in the rock pool, where the crocodile rests at the bottom in the cool, dark water, motionless, its metabolism adjusted to the reduced resources of a contracted world, its patience equal to any interval the desert is willing to impose. It is in a sense that the sediment record confirms and the bone record supports, still living in the green Sahara, not in any metaphorical sense, not in any sense that requires the imagination to fill a gap, but in the specific biological sense that its ancestors were in this landscape when it was well watered and biologically abundant, and it has remained in this landscape as it contracted around them, finding the last available pocket of the conditions they required and remaining there, patient and unhurried, in the only water left. The night on the Toggan Plateau is long. The pool surface does not move. The crocodile at the bottom does not move. The stars turn in their long arc overhead, and the plateau is dry and still in every direction, and the water in the pool holds its own small warmth against the cooling air of the Saharan night, and the animal in it is as it has been for the entirety of the interval since the last monsoon rains retreated from this latitude, simply present, waiting without knowing it, is waiting, remaining without choosing to remain, living in the only conditions available to it, in the last available expression of a world that the sediment record knows in its full extent and that the pool has been keeping quietly and without ceremony in the particular form of one motionless crocodile in the dark cold water for a very long time. The excavation trench at Gobero opens in the pale Tenere sand like a dark seam in pale cloth. It is early morning. The surrounding desert extends in every direction to a flat, colorless horizon, the dunes low and evenly spaced, the air still and not yet hot. At the floor of the trench, perhaps 1.5 meters below the present surface, the sediment changes. The pale wind-blown mineral sand gives way to something darker, a lake deposit, organic rich, carrying within its compressed chemistry the record of water that stood here for millennia, and emerging from that darker layer, partly uncovered by careful brushwork, the curve of a human forehead. The bone is pale, almost cream-colored, its surface faintly striated. A smear of red ochre is still visible along the cranial surface, pressed there by human hands in a moment that the surrounding desert has since sealed and held without alteration for roughly 10,000 years. This is Gobero. The site lies in what is now the Tenere region of Niger, a part of the Sahara so arid that it is considered among the most desolate terrain on Earth. A place where the modern annual rainfall is measured not in centimeters, but in fractions of millimeters, where no surface water has been present in any form accessible to human life for thousands of years. The excavation trench does not look like the floor of what was once a lakeshore. Nothing about the surrounding landscape suggests that this flat, sand-covered depression was once the margin of a deep, biologically productive body of water. Nothing about the light, or the heat, or the absolute aridity of the air suggests that here, among sedges and water-loving grasses at the edge of a lake, people once built fires and prepared food and buried their dead. The evidence says otherwise. The sediment says otherwise. The bone in the trench says otherwise, lying in lake mud in the driest place on Earth, still holding its pigment after 10 millennia. Paul Sereno and his colleagues formally described Gobero in a paper published in 2008, and the scope of what the site contained was, even measured against the accumulated findings of decades of Saharan research, remarkable. The excavations identified skeletal remains from at least 200 individuals, making Gobero the largest known prehistoric cemetery in the Sahara. The burials were not scattered randomly across the site. They were arranged, intentional, carefully made. They were the work of communities that understood themselves as communities, that had developed across generations of life beside that ancient lake, a set of practices for marking the passage of their members, for acknowledging death, with particular physical gestures that persisted across time. The people buried in the earlier of the two occupational layers are referred to in the research literature as the Kiffian. They were here roughly 10,000 to 8,000 years ago, during a period when the lake at Gobero was full and deep, and held the kind of stable, well-oxygenated water that supported substantial fish populations. The Kiffian were, by the measurements available from their skeletal remains, notably tall. Analysis suggests average male stature approaching 183 centimeters, which places them well above average for ancient populations anywhere in the world during this period. Their bones were robust, the remains of their meals, preserved in the same lake sediment layers that hold their burials, confirm a diet built around the largest animals the lake and its margins could provide. Hippopotamus bones appear in the refuse deposits, aurochs bones appear, warthog, and fish, the bones of large, heavy fish taken from deep water, including species that require the kind of permanent, substantial lake that the Tenere has not held in any form for 6,000 years. There is something worth holding here for a moment. The same sediment that contains human bones also contains hippopotamus bone. The same dark lake deposit that records the presence of Kiffian families also records the presence of Nile perch, a fish that can reach 200 kilograms and that requires an environment so different from present-day Gobero that the two realities are almost impossible to hold in the mind simultaneously. The trench is in the Tenere. The Tenere is among the most arid places on Earth. Oh, the bones in the trench are the bones of people who lived beside a deep lake full of enormous fish, in a landscape that also supported hippopotamus. These facts do not resolve into a comfortable image. They simply coexist in the sediment, waiting. Then the lake dried. A sterile sand layer runs through the Gobero sediment sequence, pale, mineral, containing no organic material and no cultural evidence, marking the period, roughly 8,000 years ago, during which the site was abandoned. This was a dry interval within the larger humid period, a temporary return toward arid conditions that emptied the lake and drove the people who had lived beside it away. The sterile layer is not deep. It does not represent thousands of years, but it is clean and it is empty, and it records a moment when Gobero was simply a dry pan in a desert, with no one present to leave any trace at all. The people who returned when the water came back are called the Tenarian. They arrived at Gobero during a second humid interval, and they were physically distinct from the Kiffian, their bones more gracile, their stature somewhat less pronounced, their material culture different in ways that suggest they came from a different population or tradition. They fished the lake and hunted its margins. They buried their dead in the same ground where the Kiffian had buried theirs. Though without any apparent awareness that they were doing so, the two burial populations are stratigraphically separated. The Tenarian graves above the sterile sand layer, the Kiffian graves below it. Among the Tenarian burials, the excavations at Gobero recovered something that has remained, in the years since its publication, one of the most quietly affecting archaeological discoveries made anywhere in the Sahara. In a shallow pit, 3 skeletons were found together, a woman, 2 children. They were arranged in close physical contact, their arm bones and leg bones interleaved in the particular geometry of people who have been placed rather than fallen, positioned with care, with deliberate attention to where each body rested in relation to the others. The woman's arms appear to have encircled the children. The children's bones are oriented toward her. The posture of the grouping is, within the limits of what skeletal evidence can establish, consistent with an embrace, 3 people lying together as if sleeping, placed in the ground by other hands that arranged them this way on purpose. Pollen analysis of the sediment around the burial indicated the presence of pollen from water-loving flowering plants, species that would have been blooming at the lake margin at the time the grave was dug. The interpretation offered in the research literature is careful and measured. The pollen may represent flowers placed with the bodies, or it may represent background vegetation pollen present throughout the lake margin sediments. The record does not confirm the flowers with certainty. The evidence suggests them without establishing them. What the evidence does establish is the physical arrangement, the 3 bodies in their deliberate embrace, the shallow pit, the lake margin, the dark sediment, and leaves the rest in the particular kind of productive uncertainty that careful archaeology preserves rather than resolves. Gobero is in many respects the most concentrated record of human life in the Green Sahara that the research literature has so far produced. But Gobero was not a world. It was a lakeshore settlement in one corner of a vast inhabited landscape, and the people who lived and died there were part of a network of communities distributed across millions of square kilometers of productive land that is now desert. Understanding the full scope of that human world requires widening the frame considerably, moving away from the specificity of a single site and its bones, and looking instead at the broader patterns that the archaeological record across the Sahara preserves. One of the most significant of those patterns involves cattle. The presence of domestic cattle in the Sahara during the humid period is documented across an enormous geographic range and a time span extending across several millennia. A cattle pastoralism appears to have emerged in what is now Sudan and the eastern Libyan desert by approximately 9,000 to 10,000 years ago, making it among the earliest documented instances of cattle domestication anywhere in the world. By approximately 7,000 years ago, cattle-keeping communities had spread their way of life from the Nile Valley to the Atlantic margins of the Western Sahara. a geographic range that measured across its full extent encompasses a distance comparable to crossing the continental United States from coast to coast. The record for this movement is not primarily written in bone, though cattle bones do appear at Saharan sites throughout the humid period. The most vivid and geographically distributed evidence for the cattle pastoralists of the Green Sahara is engraved and painted on stone. Rock art panels depicting cattle appear across Algeria, Libya, Niger, Mali, Chad, Mauritania, and beyond. Images of individual animals rendered with careful attention to their physical characteristics, the arc of their horns, the drape of their dewlaps, the variation in their coat patterns. The dewlap evidence is particularly worth noting. The pronounced dewlap, the fold of skin hanging from the throat and chest, is a characteristic of the domesticated cattle breeds of sub-Saharan Africa, and its careful depiction in Saharan rock art is regarded by researchers as evidence not only of domestic cattle, but of selective breeding practices sophisticated enough to have already produced recognizably distinct varieties. These were not wild animals. They were animals that had been living alongside humans for generations, shaped by human choices about which animals to breed, cared for and managed and moved across the landscape by people who understood their needs and organized their own movements around those needs. A cattle engraving panel on a rock face in the Libyan Fezzan, photographed at oblique light so that the incised lines cast sharp shadows across the pale sandstone, shows a herd of 8 animals with individually rendered horn shapes and varied markings. At the left edge of the panel, a human figure extends one arm toward the foremost animal, holding what appears to be a rope. The proportions are assured. The gesture is economical and precise. Someone pressed a stone tool against that rock face in a landscape that no longer exists, and recorded with genuine observational skill an ordinary moment from their working life, a person leading an animal, a herd moving through grass that the surrounding stone desert has not seen in thousands of years. The cattle period of Saharan rock art is dated to approximately 7,500 to 4,000 years ago, and it represents the most extensive phase of rock art production in the Sahara in terms of the total number of images. Across the entire Saharan rock art record, cattle period panels outnumber those of any other stylistic phase. This is not a coincidence. It reflects the scale and duration of the pastoral occupation, the long centuries during which cattle-keeping communities moved their herds across a landscape that was productive enough to sustain them, that held enough water and grass to make the pastoral life viable across an area that is today stone and sand and silence. The rock art record is, in this sense, a kind of measure of human presence. The more people there were, living in more places for longer periods, the more images accumulated on the available stone surfaces. The cattle period images do not only show animals. Human figures appear throughout, milking, leading, herding, in postures that suggest the daily routines of pastoral life. A figure crouches beneath a cow, arms extended in the gesture of milking. A group of human figures moves in a line behind a herd, the animals rendered larger than the people, the composition suggesting the priority given to the animals in a way of life organized entirely around their well-being and movement. There are images of encampments suggested by the arrangement of figures. There are images that appear to show animals being managed at water sources, postures and groupings consistent with the particular activity of watering livestock at a lake or river margin. These are not ceremonial images, or not only ceremonial. Many of them appear to record the practical texture of an everyday life that was, for the people who lived it, simply the way life worked, the way food was obtained, the way space was organized, the way the day moved from the morning watering to the midday rest to the evening return. That world rested on water. Every aspect of the pastoral life documented in the Saharan rock art was possible only because the landscape held enough rainfall to sustain the grasses and shrubs and shallow lakes that the cattle required. And across the span of the cattle period, from roughly 7,500 to 4,000 years ago, that water was present, and then it was not. The drying was not sudden in most regions. The research record suggests that many areas experienced a gradual deterioration, a slow withdrawal of reliable rainfall that would have been perceptible to human communities, not as a single event, but as a long pattern. Years when the grasses returned, years when they were thinner, seasons when the lakes shrank and did not fully recover, seasons when the water came back and the grasses recovered and life continued as it had before, and then, over generations, the unmistakable accumulation of evidence that the landscape was changing in a direction it had not changed in living memory, or in the memory of anyone whose stories the community carried. The archaeological record preserves this slow change in ways that are, once the pattern is understood, quietly legible. At sites across the Saharan and Sahelo-Sudanian belt, the occupational layers thin and then stop. Hearths appear in the record and then do not appear again. Faunal assemblages shift as the larger water-dependent species disappear from the refuse deposits and are replaced by drier-adapted animals, or by nothing at all. Survey data from Egypt's western desert, analyzed in the research of scholars including Fakhri Hassan and Fred Wendorf, shows a pattern of site distribution and occupational chronology consistent with a gradual eastward movement of populations, communities shifting their range toward the Nile Valley as the western desert dried, following the water, following the grass, moving across a landscape that was, decade by decade, offering less of what sustained them. The sites in Egypt's western desert that document this process are, by the standards of the later Egyptian record, modest. They are the remains of camps rather than settlements, scatters of stone tools, fragments of pottery, the bones of animals consumed in meals, hearths lined with stones and filled with charcoal and ash. Fred Wendorf's field notes from one such survey record the coordinates of a site dated to approximately 6,000 years before the present, and note, in the plain language of field documentation, that there is no surface water within 300 kilometers in any direction, that whatever allowed people to live here when this site was occupied no longer exists, and has not existed for a very long time. The accumulation of this survey evidence Ebony from Zong, combined with isotopic studies of skeletal populations from pre-dynastic Egyptian burials, has led researchers to argue that the movement of Saharan communities toward the Nile was not merely incidental, not simply a gradual drift along the path of least resistance, but a demographic and cultural contribution to the conditions that produced early Egyptian civilization. The argument advanced by Hassan and Wendorf, among others, is that the Nile Valley in the centuries immediately preceding the emergence of the Egyptian state received an influx of populations from the drying interior, people who brought with them the accumulated knowledge and the social organization and the particular mix of traditions that had developed across millennia of life in a productive and spatially vast landscape. The evidence for this argument is not simple, and it is not universally accepted, but the isotopic data from pre-dynastic skeletal populations suggests population mixing, and the archaeological record of the western desert suggests the direction from which that mixing came. What that argument points toward is something that is easy to state and takes longer to fully absorb. The drying of the Green Sahara was not only an ecological event, it was not only the withdrawal of rainfall from a landscape that had been productive, it was the closing of a world that had been continuously inhabited and culturally elaborated across thousands of years, a world in which people had developed fishing technologies and burial practices, and cattle herding strategies and systems of meaning, complex enough to produce the rock art record that the Saharan stone surfaces still hold. When that world ended, the people who had built their lives within it did not simply disappear. They moved. They carried what they knew. They arrived somewhere else and contributed to whatever was being built there. And the particular mixture of what they brought and what they found produced something that would eventually leave a written record, though the contribution of the desert communities to that record is preserved not in text, but in bone chemistry and site distribution, and the accumulated inference of decades of careful field research. A fragment of wavy line pottery from a Saharan pastoral site, its surface decorated with a fine-toothed comb impression pressed into the clay before firing, sits now in a labeled bag among the finds from a survey site in the central Sahara. The wavy line tradition is one of the oldest ceramic traditions documented anywhere in Africa. Vessels made by people who needed containers for water and stored food, who had developed a technology of clay and fire that was functional and also, in its surface decoration, deliberately beautiful. The comb-impressed wavy line is not random. It required a specific tool, applied in a specific motion, with a specific intent. Someone made this pottery and used it and left it behind, and the ground kept it, and the research eventually found it. And now it sits in its bag in a storage room somewhere, labeled with coordinates and a date range, one small fragment of a material culture that extended across a landscape the size of a continent for a duration measured in millennia. The pastoral communities of the Green Sahara did not leave written texts. They did not leave administrative records or royal inscriptions or the kind of structured documentary evidence that allows historians to follow a civilization's internal logic from its own perspective. What they left was bone and stone and pigment and pottery and the spatial distribution of their camps and the isotopic signatures in their skeletons and the incised lines on rock faces that are still being documented and analyzed and argued over by researchers working in some of the most physically demanding field
conditions in the world.
This is a particular kind of record. It requires a particular kind of reading. The inferences it supports are carefully hedged by the researchers who work with it, and the questions it leaves open are in many cases the most fundamental ones: what these people called themselves, what they believed, what they told their children about the world and their place in it, what it meant to them to be the people they were in, the place they lived. Those questions the record cannot answer. The sediment holds the bones and the charcoal and the pollen, but it does not hold the language or the stories. What it holds is enough to establish that the people were real, that they lived here, that they were tall and robust and organized enough to bury their dead with care, that they developed cattle, pastoralism, and distributed it across an enormous range, that they created rock art on a scale that places the Saharan image tradition among the largest and most geographically extensive bodies of prehistoric visual art known anywhere on Earth, and that when their landscape dried, they moved toward the water, and that movement eventually brought their descendants into contact with the river valley that would become the site of one of the most thoroughly documented civilizations in human history. The archaeological record at Kibero ends for the Tenarian occupation somewhere around 6,000 years ago, as the lake at last dried and did not come back. The uppermost cultural layer before the final sterile sand seal contains the last hearths, the last refuse deposits, the last evidence of daily life. At some point, the lake shrank below the level at which it could sustain the fishing and the hippopotamus populations that had organized Kiffian life beside its shores. At some point, the water-loving grasses at the margin dried back, and the mud cracked, and the exposed lake floor began to blow away in the wind. The people who were there when that happened would have understood what it meant in terms of immediate survival. The water going, the fish going, the game going, the grass going, without necessarily understanding the larger planetary processes that had delivered the rain in the first place and were now, with the same patient indifference, withdrawing it. They moved. The record does not say where, exactly, or in what direction, or across how many seasons the decision accumulated from a gathering difficulty into a necessary departure. It says only that they were there, and then they were not, and the sand came in over the last of their fires and sealed the record. The last campfire at a Saharan pastoral site is preserved in an archaeological layer as a ring of stones around a lens of charcoal and ash, with cattle bones from a final meal scattered within it. The stones are still in their arrangement. The charcoal is still there. Above it, clean wind-blown sand moved in and covered it, not all at once, but gradually, grain by grain, as the landscape around it dried, and the binding vegetation died back, and the exposed sand began to move. The hearth is sealed now. The cattle bones are sealed with it. The people who built that fire and ate that meal and lived in the green Sahara in one of its last inhabited seasons left no record of the moment, no inscription, no marker, no object placed with deliberate intent to be found by later hands. But somewhere along the Nile, in the generations and centuries that followed, people arrived who had come from the west, from the interior, from a landscape that was drying at their backs. They brought what they had carried, the knowledge of cattle, the knowledge of water management, the knowledge of how to organize a community across a vast and shifting terrain, the knowledge of how to bury the dead with care, the knowledge of how to press meaning into clay and stone. What was built in that river valley in the centuries that followed bears in the isotopic record and the archaeological distribution and the careful inference of the research, the faint but legible signature of everything that was carried out of the desert. The people who watched a different kind of world being built along the Nile, permanent settlements, administrative structures, the first gestures toward monumental construction, carried within them the long memory of a green world that was buried under the sand they had left behind. The rock is pale and slightly curved, like the inside of a very old hand. At arm's length, in the beam of a researcher's torch, a line of ochre runs across the sandstone surface, thin as a brushstroke, faint enough that it might be missed at midday, but unmistakable here, held close in the narrow light. Above the line, the overhang cuts away the sky entirely, leaving only the smell of dry stone and the faint mineral residue of 10,000 years of slow air moving through a sheltered space. The surrounding plateau is brightening on the other side of that shadow. The painted surface is still in the dark. What was mixed to make that line has been pressed into porous sandstone since before any civilization, now remembered as ancient, had begun. The pigment is mineral ochre, which is iron oxide, which is chemistry older than any hand that gathered it. Someone ground the stone, combined it with something binding, carried it here in something that has not survived, and pressed it to this wall in a world so different from the one the plateau inhabits, now that the distance between the two is difficult to hold in the mind without releasing some part of it. Rain fell here then, reliably, seasonally, enough to sustain grass and trees and the animals that moved through both. The overhang above the painted surface provided shelter from that rain, as it provides shelter still, though from nothing. The paint has outlasted the rain by 6,000 years, perhaps more. Tassili Najer was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982. It contains an estimated 15,000 or more individual engravings and paintings spanning from at least 10,000 years ago to the early historical period, and the plateau's sandstone galleries run for hundreds of kilometers through southern Algeria, cut into mesas and eroded into corridors of pale, wind-sculpted rock. The number alone, 15,000 images, is difficult to absorb without some care. Each image was made by a person. Each person had a reason for making it, a moment in which the decision was reached, a specific hour and quality of light. The full sequence of those moments stretched across 10,000 years of people returning to these walls, or discovering them and adding to what was already there, constitutes something that has no exact parallel in the archaeological record anywhere in the world. A visual archive of ecological and cultural change across the entire arc of the African Humid Period and its aftermath, built one pressed pigment line at a time, left here without any instruction about how it should be read. The earliest images belong to what researchers call the round head style. The designation comes from the defining characteristic of the figures: large, rounded, featureless heads atop elongated bodies, their faces absent of detail, their scales sometimes reaching several meters in height. The dating of the round head style to approximately 10,000 to 7,000 years ago rests on contextual stratigraphy, the position of images beneath or above others, whose relative sequence can be established, and on optically stimulated luminescence, dating of sediment deposits associated with the painted surfaces. A figure of this kind was painted in a landscape receiving reliable seasonal rainfall, in a Sahara that still held its lakes and rivers, in a climate that still belonged to the green interval. The pigments used in the round head panels are violet, white, and ochre. A violet figure 2 meters tall stands on a Tassili Najer sandstone face in a shaded overhang, its rounded head tilted very slightly to one side, in a posture that different observers have described differently, as listening, as observing, as absorbed in something not present in the visible frame of the image. Researchers, including Jean-Loïc Lequelec, have interpreted the round head figures as potentially encoding cosmological or shamanistic content, representing some of the earliest known visual expressions of complex religious thought in North Africa. The interpretation remains interpretive rather than confirmed. What the pigment on the wall confirms is the figure's presence, its scale, the care with which the outline was maintained across a surface that would have required sustained physical effort to reach and to paint. The wall is pale and dry and utterly silent around it. The figure holds its slight tilt without any sign of ever having moved. It is worth sitting with the violet for a moment. Violet is not a color that occurs readily in a palette of ground mineral pigments. Someone identified a source, processed it, carried it, applied it to a figure several meters in height, and sustained that color across a painted surface that has remained bonded to this rock for upward of 8,000 years. The figure was not made carelessly. Nothing about its presence suggests haste or improvisation. Whatever was being done here was done with intention and with the kind of sustained material knowledge that develops slowly in communities across generations. The silence around it is not emptiness. It is the space left by everyone who once knew what the figure meant and has since been replaced, without remainder, by wind and stone. The Cave of Swimmers is several hundred kilometers away on the Gilf Kabir Plateau in southwestern Egypt. The Hungarian explorer Laszlo Almás reached it in 1933 and described it in the field note register of a careful observer: a low sandstone ceiling, no more than a meter above the ground, its surface painted with small reddish figures whose limbs extend outward at angles that suggest unmistakably the posture of people in water. The pages of Almás' 1934 expedition report give the discovery in that same matter-of-fact language, accompanied by a hand-traced copy of two of the swimming figures, their outlines rendered carefully in pencil on graph paper. A researcher in 1934, sitting with a lamp in a cave in the Egyptian desert, tracing by hand what someone painted on that ceiling in a world where the desert had not yet arrived. The cave floor is dry sand. The surrounding rock is dry. The nearest modern water source lies hundreds of kilometers away in any direction. Nearby paleo lake and river sediment deposits, analyzed in subsequent decades, confirm that the hydrological landscape the figures appear to record was real. Water was present in this region in quantities substantial enough to swim in during the period in which the figures are estimated to have been painted. The figures are not allegory. They are not symbolic water in a parched land, not a prayer for rain or a memory of flood. They are, the sediment evidence suggests, a record of ordinary activity in a landscape that made swimming ordinary. Someone painted people swimming because people were swimming. The cave's dry ceiling is the distance between that world and this one, and it is possible to measure that distance in millennia without quite feeling it, and then possible to lie on the dry sand floor and look up at those small reddish outlines and feel it all at once. The Caucasus Mountains of Libya were designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1985 for the quality and extent of their rock art. The paintings and engravings in the Caucasus run in stratigraphically layered sequences, image over image over image, across the same sandstone surfaces, and that layering is what makes them particularly valuable as a record. The sequence of species depicted across the layers can be read as a sequence of ecological presence, an archive of what lived in this region at each period of the humid interval, and what disappeared as the drying progressed. The full catalog of species represented across the Caucasus panels reads like an inventory of a world that bore no resemblance to the current Sahara. Elephants with their characteristic ear silhouettes, rhinoceros with heavy low-carried heads, hippopotamus in the rounded postures particular to an animal that spends its resting hours half submerged, giraffes with their long, patient necks, crocodiles in the horizontal stillness of animals at the waterline, abundant cattle in herds that grow larger and more detailed as the sequence moves into the later cattle period. The cattle period spans approximately 7,500 to 4,000 years ago. It represents the most extensive phase of Saharan rock art production in terms of total image count, and what it documents is a pastoral world of considerable complexity. Individual animals are rendered with close attention to coat patterns. Horn shapes vary from animal to animal in ways that reflect genuine biological variation across a maintained and selected herd. Dewlap development, the fold of skin beneath a cattle animal's throat, more pronounced in selectively bred individuals, is depicted with care that signals the eye of someone for whom these distinctions were not decorative, but practical and important. Human figures milk cows in poses that require detailed knowledge of the posture, the vessel, the technique. Human figures lead animals by nose ropes with the practiced nonchalance of people who have spent years learning how an animal's weight and resistance and rhythm must be managed. A cattle period panel in the Caucasus Mountains, photographed at dusk with the low-angle light deepening the incised lines, shows a herd of 8 animals. Each is rendered with individual variation in marking and horn shape. At the left edge of the panel, a small human figure extends an arm toward the foremost animal, the gesture of someone guiding a lead animal into movement. The human figure is small relative to the cattle, not in error, but probably in proportion to how a herder, in a landscape of very large animals, actually perceives the relational scale of their work. The dusk light in the photograph fills the incised lines with shadow, and the image becomes dimensional, briefly, as if the panel is an inhabited surface rather than a historical artifact. Then the light moves and it becomes flat again. The figures remain in the rock, patient as they have been for thousands of years, waiting for the particular angle of light that makes them briefly come forward from the stone. There is a quality particular to rock art that distinguishes it from other archaeological records. A cattle bone from an excavation or a pollen grain from a sediment core carries information that must be translated into a species name, a date range, an ecological inference about the environment in which the organism lived. The translation is reliable and the information is real, but the process of arriving at it involves distance. A painted figure on a rock face involves no translation. It was made by a hand, and a hand can be understood immediately by another hand. The scale of the gesture, the hesitation in a line where the pigment shifted or the surface offered resistance, the place where the painter adjusted the outline and the adjustment is still visible under the original mark, the 10,000-year distance between the painter and any current observer is real and does not dissolve. But something crosses it in the direct confrontation with the image that does not cross it in the confrontation with a labeled specimen tray. The Tasselina Ager Plateau, at first light, holds its painted surfaces in deep shadow, even as the surrounding rock brightens. The orientation of most painted overhangs, east-facing walls that receive morning light, west-facing walls that hold the warmth of afternoon, was not accidental. The people who painted these surfaces knew them as places, returned to them, understood the way light moved across them at different hours and seasons. The choice of where on the plateau to paint, which overhang, which face, which height above the ground, represents accumulated knowledge of a specific place accumulated over what must have been many generations of use. The shadows that hold the figures in the early morning are the same shadows that fell across them on the mornings when they were new. The light that reaches them at midday in summer is the same light, arriving from the same angle that arrived when the pigment was still wet. The figures in their morning shadow have not been counted definitively. The 15,000 estimate represents the range that survey and documentation work has established for the plateau's total inventory, but the sandstone galleries cover an area too large for comprehensive recording under current conditions, and new sites are documented in each survey season in which access is possible. The number does not represent a closed archive. It represents what has been found so far in a place that continues to hold more than has yet been formally recorded. The painted surfaces are not waiting to be discovered in any dramatic sense. They have been known and visited and described by the communities of the region for as long as those communities have existed. They are simply present. They have always been present. The formal documentation of their presence is the part that remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is not urgency. It is simply the honest description of a very large archive in a very large landscape, and time, as these surfaces have already demonstrated, is not the variable most likely to close that gap. What the cattle period paintings document has no parallel in any written record of the period. No written language existed yet in this region at the time most of these images were made. The material record left behind by pastoral communities of the Green Sahara, hearths, animal bones, potsherds, stone tools, is fragmentary in the way all excavated material is fragmentary, which is to say that it survives only where the conditions for preservation happen to align. But the paintings are a different kind of document. They were made to be seen. They were made on surfaces chosen for their visibility and their accessibility and their suitability for holding pigment. Someone decided that what these panels would show was worth the sustained effort of mixing and applying paint across surfaces, sometimes many meters in dimension. The decision implies an audience, actual people who were expected to stand here and look, to understand what was being depicted, to carry whatever the image communicated into their lives in the surrounding landscape. That audience has been replaced entirely. Every person who understood these images in their original context, who knew without instruction what the roundhead figures meant, who recognized the specific herd depicted in a cattle period panel, who could read the swimming figures on the Gilfkabir ceiling as documentation of a place they also knew, has been replaced over 10,000 years by people for whom the original context is inaccessible. The images remain, their meaning in the fullest sense of the word that would have applied when they were made does not remain with them. What survives is the physical presence of the paint on the stone, the identifiable shapes of the figures, the species they depict, the postures they record, the pigments used to render them, and the slowly accumulating body of analytical work that draws inferences from these elements about the world that produced them. That is not nothing. It is, in fact, an extraordinary amount. But it is also not everything that was here, and the difference between what survives and what was here is where the quiet rests. A roundhead figure in violet and ochre, 2 meters tall, on a slightly curved wall in a shaded overhang, its head tilted slightly to one side. The surrounding rock pale and dry, the plateau beyond the overhang edge lit by a morning that the figure does not face. The paint pressed into the porous stone so thoroughly that the boundary between pigment and rock is at the microscopic level, not a surface but a zone, the mineral of the pigment and the mineral of the stone interpenetrating in a bond that is held for 8,000 years and shows no sign of having weakened. The stone has not released it. The pigment has not released the stone. What was made here was made in the understanding, perhaps, that painted things persist, that stone holds what is pressed into it, that the image would outlast the hand that made it. The cave of swimmers in its low sandstone hollow, the ceiling's figures still faint and reddish in the midday light that enters from the cave's narrow opening. The cave floor dry sand, fine and pale, the kind of sand that records a footprint and holds it for days in the absence of wind. The figures above it in their swimming postures, arms extended, legs angled, the nearest water hundreds of kilometers from here, the Paleo Lake sediment nearby, recording the water's former presence. With the same patience, the figures record the people who swam in it. The two records, the painted figures on the ceiling and the compressed sediment layers in the basin floor, are the same document written in two different materials, and they agree with each other completely. Water was here. People were here. Both are gone now, except for what was pressed into stone and compressed into clay. The Caucasus Mountains at dusk, the last light falling across the incised lines of the cattle panel. The human figure at the left edge extending an arm toward the lead animal, a gesture so specific and so practiced that it communicates its meaning across several thousand years without any instruction. 8 cattle with individual markings, a dewlap rendered with care, the dusk light filling the incised lines and then withdrawing as the sun drops behind the ridge. The panel dark, the figures still there in the rock exactly where they were when the light made them briefly dimensional, and before that, when no light reached them, and before that, all the way back to the moment the incising tool was lifted from the last completed line, and the person who held it stepped back to see what had been made. The full sequence of Green Sahara rock art runs from the earliest roundhead images through the cattle period and into the later Cabalene period, in which horses and then camels appear, the ecological succession of a landscape drying and changing in what it could support. The camels near the end of the sequence are the clearest evidence of the drying, an animal adapted for desert conditions, appearing in rock art as the cattle that once dominated the panels become fewer and the vegetation those cattle required contracted southward and eastward ahead of the returning sand. The sequence is not a story of catastrophe recorded in images. It is a record of change observed by communities who continued to live in the landscape as it changed, continued to paint on its walls, continued to document what was present and what had moved through. The last images in the sequence at a given site simply stop, as all records stop when the people making them have gone. The rock remains, the pigment remains. Tassili Najer, at first light, the painted figures in their overhang shadow, not yet reached by the sun, moving across the plateau surface. The surrounding sandstone brightening from gray to pale gold to the particular warm tone it holds through the middle of the morning, the shadow in the overhang holding longer than the light on the open rock, the figures within it not yet visible to anyone standing outside the shadow's edge, and still held in the dark as they have been held every night for the duration of their existence, and every early morning, and every overcast afternoon, patient in the way that only things incapable of impatience can be patient, present in the way that only things made of mineral, pressed into mineral, can be present. The pain itself is the final and most concrete fact. Iron oxide in ochre, manganese oxide in the darker pigments, calcium carbonate in the whites, minerals that have been in this rock or in contact with it since before the first pigment was mixed and applied. The painting did not introduce these minerals to the sandstone. It introduced them in a new arrangement, in shapes that carry meaning, at a scale and with a specificity of form that does not occur in nature. That is what was done here, across 15,000 or more individual acts of image making, across 10,000 years. Minerals were arranged into shapes that a human being intended, and the sandstone held the arrangement, and time has not yet dissolved the bond. The green world that was here when these images were first made has been gone for long enough that the land beneath the surface still holds its chemical trace. Rain that fell 6,000 years ago still persists in the mineral composition of grains that have not been touched by sunlight since. The lakes whose shorelines can still be read in the wave-cut terraces of the Chadian lowlands have been empty for millennia. The rivers that ran beneath what is now the eastern Sahara's sand sheets have not carried water in a span of time that exceeds any human institution still in existence. The animals whose bones were pressed into lake sediment at Gobero have been absent from those latitudes for as long as the Sahara has been what it is now. The people who fished those lakes and herded across those grasslands and pressed pigment into these walls are not here. The pigment is here. An overhang on the Tassili Niger plateau at first light, shadow in the recess where the painted wall stands,